Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another week's episode of GetPsyched, and today we're going to be taking a look at the psychology of phobias. Now, we're going to be taking a look at what phobias are, how phobias come about, what kind of phobias people experience, and the treatment options available for people that are experiencing phobias, so stay tuned. Also guys, make sure to hit the subscribe button to GetPsyched. If you've been enjoying GetPsyched recently, you can hit that bell next to the subscribe button and you'll get weekly reminders every time I upload. If you're enjoying today's video as well, make sure to hit that like button. You can comment on the video as well and I'll be sure to get back to you. What do you think of when you first think of phobias? You perhaps have your own perceptions. Maybe you start thinking a little bit about fear of spiders, fear of dogs, and then if you're getting into the little bit more obscure, the fear of clowns, or even people that have like fear of bad weather, these kind of things. There's some really obscure phobias. There's some phobias that maybe to some extent we all experience. But what is the difference between being a little bit afraid of something and having a phobia of it? Well, we're going to take a little bit of a look at that because I'm sure not everybody, I would say 90% of the population, aren't that keen about being around a really horrible big spider. However, what's the difference between that and a phobia? Spiders, for example, let's take a look at that as an example. Spiders, let's say, I'm not a spider expert, but let's say spiders reside in the woods, okay? People know that there are spiders in the woods. It's not that common for people to not go into the woods because they know that there might be a spider there. If you have a phobia though, that might be an option where you decide not to go to the woods because there may be a spider. What I'm getting at is that phobia is the difference between a fear of something and a phobia is a phobia stops us from doing things. It limits our lives. It creates decisions for us. It might say to us, you know what, I'm not going to go to that place or I'm not going to do that thing in case my fear is there. Phobias are actually one of the most common psychiatric disorders in the world. Around 10% of the world's population suffer from this, and it's classified in the DSM-5 as a psychiatric disorder. I actually think it might be the most common psychiatric disorder. And there are so many different types of phobias. Phobias like arachnophobia that we know, agoraphobia, social phobia. But there's also other kinds of phobias like pyrophobia, which is the fear of fire, or electorophobia, which is the fear of chickens. There's even phobophobia, which is the phobia of getting a phobia, if that makes sense. What I'm trying to get at there, though, is that there's so many kind of phobias that we know. There's also different kinds of phobias, and a lot of them sound really, really obscure, but they don't stop the kind of life-limiting element on the people that suffer from them. So what actually is a phobia? Well, in many ways, it's a symptom of an anxiety disorder. It's a response to a high level of anxiety. And generally, people assume that phobias are actually a response to a suppressed fear. So for example, somebody might have a childhood experience that results in a phobia that then is correlated to different stimulus, and that original fear is suppressed. Let's take an example for a minute. If a child nearly drowns in a swimming pool, okay, I know this is a horrible example, but if a child nearly drowns in a swimming pool, that child might then grow into adulthood to have an overall sense or fear or phobia of water. That fear of that, that situation where they nearly drowned is suppressed, and instead the fear is correlated to other stimulus, such as water in general. The phobia then often perpetuates because that person might think, right, in order to manage my anxiety in the immediate moment, I need to avoid water. And that actually sounds like an effective response. If it's something that causes you anxiety, then avoid it. And in common society, that's maybe what we think, but actually the opposite is true. That person is sacrificing long-term gain for short-term benefit. If they avoid water in the immediate moment, their anxiety in the immediate moment is going to go down. However, all they're reinforcing is that there is something that they need to avoid. So the more I stay away from water, the more I'm reinforcing or reassuring myself that water is scary. So that kind of gets into a little bit of the treatment process that we might talk about in a little bit about exposure therapy, because one of the things with phobias is that they become a perpetual cycle. We may have that initial fear, we might have that event. It's not always events that are correlated to phobias, but it may then lead to a phobia that's then perpetuated by our behavioural responses. Now, if we take a look at some theories of phobias, actually what I've just expressed there about what a phobia is very much correlated to Freud's psychoanalytic theory of phobias. And he basically says that the id, the superego, and the ego all play a role here. The id is that kind of primal emotive centre, and the superego is that kind of higher conscious level emotive centre. The ego in between is the kind of moderator between the two. And Freud stated that phobias are the foundation where the id experiences a fear and it's suppressed by the ego. And in many ways, that's kind of what we've just expressed there with our example of the child that nearly drowned. The id experienced that primal emotion of the fear of nearly drowning, And as that child grew into adulthood, the ego suppressed that with avoiding situations of water or correlating that fear to water in general to manage the emotions, the primal emotions of that id. Now, in many ways, biologically, that all makes sense. And on a theoretical stance, Freud, in many ways, was right. I know not everybody agrees with that, but Freud, in this sense, was right with his psychoanalytic theory on phobias. The id, that primal center, really does have that, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is happening, I need to do something. And then the ego suppresses it throughout life. And actually, that's how that phobia perpetuates. We can also understand phobias a little bit better by Pavlov's learning theory. And if you're any way into psychology or study psychology, Pavlov's dogs is a really famous psychological study where he was able to make dogs salivate on a cue with a bell when they were fed. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Pavlov's study, you can find it online. But basically, it's about conditioning. These dogs were able to salivate at the ring of a bell because they were getting fed and that bell was ringing at the same time. Pavlov found that actually just the ringing of the bell on its own was enough of a stimulus to make those dogs salivate. And it led to kind of the building of more and more theories. And that learning theory in many ways was used as a bedrock for understanding phobias a little bit better. And learning theory stipulates that phobias perpetuate based on them either being reinforced or them being punished. And in many ways, we can understand that. Again, the reinforcement of these phobias is something we need to understand. The phobia is there, but often it perpetuates more and more and more by reinforcement. Now that can be through avoidance, like we talked about when that person avoided water. That's how that phobia builds. They can also be perpetuated via punishment. Again, if we look at a really terrible example, but if you think of somebody who's maybe been locked away in their childhood in a really darkened room, and somebody who's spent a lot of time in confined spaces, there may be a phobia of enclosed spaces going into adulthood. That use of punishment to enforce somebody into those environments can then lead to phobias moving forward. So that's again off that back of that learning theory. We understand the reinforcement element. There's also that punishment element too. There's also a third theory that I think we can bring into the mix here. There's many theories about phobias, but I think it would be misplaced to not talk about the biological theory, which stipulates that there's a neurochemistry element to phobias and there's a kind of neuropsychology dimension. And if you want to know a little bit more about neuropsychology and mental health, check out last week's video. We looked at that. We looked at the brain and mental health. We looked at neuropsychology and mental well-being. So check out that last video. You'll learn a little bit more about neuropsychology. But it's argued also that neuropsychology plays a role in phobias as well. Now, the research is pretty thin, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that theory, but one of the ways in which they stipulate that biological factor can have an influence on phobias is that actually SSRI medication or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are having an impact on people's response to phobias. And that's been correlated a few times, that's been studied a few times. So there may be something on a neurochemistry basis going on here that talks about actually, do you know what, there's a biological factor. There's also something in the genetics, or rather the generational transference of phobias. If your parents have got a phobia in something, it's very likely that you may have that phobia. Now, I'm always speculative of these kind of neuropsychology theories, and it may be more than just the fact that your parents are passing on a genetic makeup that means that you're going to experience phobias the same way that they do. When actually what could be happening is that their fear of a certain phobia maybe just kind of may resonate with you as you grow up. You may be exposed to that. So it may be more of a social thing, maybe more of an interpersonal thing as opposed to a biological thing. But we can never rule these things out in psychology. So there may be a neurochemistry element to phobias. Now, when we're understanding phobias a little bit better, we need to know that there are different types of phobias. And there's actually three main categories of phobias correlated within the DSM-5, which in psychology and medicine is one of those key textbooks that we use. It's not always accurate, of course, but it's one of those key textbooks that we use to understand psychiatric disorders a little bit, or mental health disorders a little bit better. And it says that the first category of phobias are specific phobias, and they actually break those down into 5 separate categories. And they include things like people who are scared of flying, people who are scared of clowns, people who are scared of needles and blood, people who are scared of dark places. So these are kind of specific phobias that people experience. Agoraphobia agoraphobia is that third category that the DSM-5 talk about, and that is where people are afraid of those kind of social encounters, or they're afraid of meeting new people, or even people that they already know. And I think in one way, this is where we can understand more about what phobias actually are, because I think all of us experience a level of nervousness, anxiety when we're about to meet new people. Maybe if you're about to do some public speaking, or you're about to meet, your partner's friends for the first time. That kind of thing's anxiety provoking. So why is that not a phobia? Well, A phobia is, again, when people avoid a situation in case they experience it, or when their life to some degree is limited, or they stop themselves doing things because of that fear. So somebody who has agoraphobia may just avoid social connections with people altogether. They may stop going out with friends. They may eventually just lock themselves in their flat. They have anxiety about social interactions. You may have anxiety about social interactions, but their life is totally limited. It's really, really confined. That's when we would start classifying that as a phobia. So agoraphobia is that real fear of social interaction with other people when they just don't want to experience connection with other people. Social phobia is a kind of third category that the DSM-5 talk about, and that's about when people are afraid of being judged or embarrassed in front of others. And again, this is about proportionality. Again, we may all experience these fears to some degree. Phobias are different though. Phobias are when people stop themselves doing things because of that fear. Again, it's about proportionality. But that third category from the DSM-5 is social phobias. So what kind of treatment options are available for people that have phobias to some degree? We've understood a little bit more about the theoretical makeup of phobias. We understand what phobias there are and actually what a phobia really is. How does it get treated? Well, therapy can be incredibly helpful. And exposure therapy is one of the key treatment options for phobias. And they talk about systematic desensitization, which is really hard to say, but that's what exposure therapy basically is. It's like a staggered process of exposing somebody to that fear. Again, remember when we were talking about the repeated cycle of phobias and how these things can become perpetuated and they can become reinforced by people? Therapy hopes to do the opposite and start to, stopping that process of that perpetual cycle, trying to stop that cycle as much as possible, and also look at maybe the roots of that phobia. So let's look at our example again. The person who maybe drowned in that swimming pool as a young child. Therapy might delve into that fear and understand what that was about and experience that and process that emotion again and that fear. It may then also look at the perpetual cycle that person has instilled, that fear of water and avoiding water to the point where these things are reinforced. Exposure therapy may try and act on that as well and say, right, let's start the process of being exposed to water a little bit more. If you think of like a spider, somebody who's got arachnophobia, maybe they come to therapy and maybe exposure therapy is the option for that client. What might happen is they may do that systematic desensitization where they're slowly introduced to the spider. There's also another form of exposure therapy called flooding, which is when somebody's scared of a clown or somebody's scared of clowns. They might walk into a room of 15 clowns all dressed up, like immediately. That's flooding, where the theory goes that kind of fear is just zonked out of somebody in the immediate moment. I don't think that's as effective as systematic desensitization, but that's when it's more of a staggered process. So somebody who's got arachnophobia, for example, as I was saying, they've got a fear of spiders. The thing that they're not going to do is bring a spider into that room. They may talk about a spider. They may then draw a spider. They may look at the picture of a spider on a computer. They may watch a video of a spider. The therapist then may bring a spider into an enclosed box into the room, 10 meters away from that person. And as you can see, slowly that process is increased and it's staged and it's brought up to the point where that person may even be able to hold a spider in their hands. That is what systematic desensitization is all about. The process of exposing that person to that phobia, the process of stopping that perpetual cycle. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can also be really helpful, and it encourages people to be mindful of that fear and to experience the irrationality of that fear. One of the things about phobias is the irrational basis. Somebody may catastrophize. Catastrophizing is something really big in cognitive behavioral therapy that we talk about. So somebody who's got a fear of clowns might think, oh my goodness, this clown is going to cut me up to bits and eat me. That's a really irrational fear. That's somebody who's catastrophizing. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps us to identify that fear, helps us to identify that irrationality and move forward from there. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this week's episode of GetPsyched. This week we've been taking a look at the psychology of phobias. We've been taking a look at the theoretical makeup of phobias, what phobias are all about, the different kinds of phobias and the treatment options for phobias. I would be really interested to know your thoughts on today's videos, guys. Make sure to hit that like button. You can comment and I'll answer your questions. You can share the video as well. And if you've been enjoying GetPsyched as a whole, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and you'll get weekly reminders every time I upload. Thanks again so much for watching, guys, and hopefully catch you next week.